The book I'm talking about today, I've decided to talk about in a way that's a little different from the way that I've been approaching the material on this channel. Typically, what I've been doing is I've been looking for things that were not science fiction or fantasy, whether they were fiction or nonfiction, and seeing what kind of lessons could be gleaned from them that could be used in the writing of science fiction and fantasy. I had ideas about how to do that with the book that I'm about to talk about. But after I finished reading it, I said to myself, maybe the best thing to do is to just talk about the book, because the experience of reading this book was honestly so overwhelming that I don't want to cheapen the lessons that it has to give generally to anyone, no matter what they're writing, no matter what kind of reader they are. The book in question is Babi by Anatoly Kuznetsov. There's a fair chance a lot of people watching this have not heard of the book, and a big part of that is because it's fluctuated in and out of print over the years. And only recently has it been brought back into print in this new edition, which I can't recommend strongly enough. It has a new introduction by Masha Gessen, who is one of the best writers about modern Russia that you're likely to encounter. I highly recommend her other books as well. And the book is essentially, he describes it as a documentary novel, which I found a really interesting way to put it, because it's basically a memoir and an autobiography and an expose all rolled into one. The author was a young boy during World War II, and he grew up outside of Kiev near the ravine named Babi Yar. And for those of you who are students of the Holocaust, or of history generally, really, you will know that this was the site of a number of infamous massacres that were committed by the Nazis. Many, many people, tens of thousands of people, Jews and many others alike, lost their lives here. At the beginning, it was used as an execution ground for Jews specifically, but then later turned into a more general massacre ground for people who were convicted of any number of other offenses, whether real or imagined. They were simply herded into the ravine and shot. And Kuznetsov talks about this experience, at first at arm's length, the way that he experienced it as a young man at a distance, and then by way of people that he had interviewed who managed to survive and were able to relate back pieces of the experience of what had happened there. And they are incredibly hard to read and to think about. And that's all layered on top of the experiences that he had as a young man, scrabbling to grow up and survive in the middle of the war, dealing with the way the Nazis had imposed their own iron rule on everything. And also the way that the rule of the Nazis was to be contrasted with the way that the Soviets had also ruled them. And the younger Kuznetsov, as well as his later adult counterpart, really saw very little difference between the two. One form of tyranny was no better than another form of tyranny, especially when it meant that everyone starved and people were simply rounded up and shot for reasons that were utterly arbitrary. So reading the book is a difficult experience. I won't sugarcoat that at all. This is a tough book to read, but at the end of it, I was grateful that the author had not only been able to survive the experience, but to put it into such direct language and to make the whole thing come alive so vividly. I was originally going to read it over the space of about a week, and I ended up reading it over the space of about 3 to 4 days, because I would sit down and I would tell myself, oh, I'm only going to read this many pages, and I would end up riveted. I would end up reading much further than my intended quota. And because it is an emotionally exhausting experience to read the book, I would find myself rather drained afterwards, but I could not put it down all the same. So again, the book has a lot of different reasons to be valued as a memoir of growing up, as an expose of wartime crimes, as many other things altogether. And that composite quality that it has is reflected in other aspects of it as well, which I was honestly not expecting when I read this book. See, this is not the first time that I've read this book. I originally read this book many years ago in a very different edition that was published by Washington Square Press in a paperback edition. And I bought this, I think, if memory serves, from a street vendor. I think it was in New York City for like 50 cents. And it was in terrible shape. It looked like it had been dropped in the water and it was falling apart as I read it. But I couldn't stop. I remembered reading it and being riveted by it. And then because it was falling to pieces, I had to abandon it. And then the story kind of got pushed into the back of my mind. And I said, I need to go revisit this. But it was very hard to find a copy because it was between printings. The copies that I could find were rather extortionistically priced, to be honest. and other things came up and got in the way. And then when I heard that this new edition came out, I grabbed it up because in the meantime, I had learned some really astonishing facts about the publication of this book generally. When Kuznetsov first wrote it, the very first version of it that he wrote was stuff that he wrote down when he was essentially still a boy. And it was later expanded as an adult into a full-length work. And when he submitted this work for publication at one of the big literary magazines in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, they took one look at it and they said, we're not going to be able to publish this unless you cut out all the anti-Soviet stuff in it. Because whenever he would mention the Nazis, he would also mention the Soviets in basically the same breath. And of course, this would not fly, not even in the relatively liberal period of the 1960s, where there was what they called the thaw in literary expression at the time. And so people were being allowed to say that many more things about previous regimes. But even then, this still wouldn't work. So he made some cuts to the book and resubmitted it. And then the censors came in and cut even more out of it. They cut it to the point where it was basically turned into a simple-minded anti-Nazi propaganda tract. But that was the version that was going to get published, or it wasn't going to get published at all. And so by the time it came out, people were telling him, you probably don't even want to read it in the version that they're publishing. You're going to be so upset by what you see. But even this badly censored version created a sensation in the Soviet Union. And such a sensation that people would cut out from the magazine that it had been published in and rebind it together in the form of a book long before it was ever actually published as a book. And eventually Kuznetsov realized that the version of the book that he wanted to see the light of day was not going to be available in the Soviet Union. And he defected to the West. And when he left the Soviet Union and went to England, he wore a jacket that had sewn into its lining microfilmed copies of all of his books, including the original manuscript of Babi. And so after he defected, the book was then prepared for publication. And in the process, he said to himself, there's a lot in there that I could expand on. So he added some more material where he saw fit to expand on things or give them context or just put on paper stuff that had sort of been hanging over his head in the interim. And so in essence, you had three books. You had Kuznetsov's original book, the uncensored version. You had the version that the Soviet censors had created by deleting so much of his material. And then you had his uncensored and expanded edition of the book, which was what was finally published in English and eventually through the rest of the world. And the amazing thing about this edition of Babi, which is essentially a reprint of the original version that was published in English, was that it contains all three of these versions at the same time. What they did was really quite clever. The basic text of the book is printed in a certain typeface. And all of the areas that were deleted by the censors are indicated by boldface. And all of the areas that were added by Kuznetsov are indicated in square brackets. So you're essentially reading through this device three books at the same time, all on top of each other. Now the kicker is that when I read the Washington Square Press version, it didn't have any of this typography. It had all been retypeset, all in a single uniform typeface. There was no indication of what had been added or removed. So when I later found out about this, I said, oh, I'd better go track that version down because that's going to be a very different experience. And it wasn't until I picked up this new reprinted version that I was finally able to read for myself completely and experience completely just what it was like to read what Kuznetsov intended and also to see how the censors had transformed it into something completely against its original intentions. So that metatextual quality of the book is something that enhances for me the fact that it's also a quest for the truth, because the truth isn't just about fact, it's about how you frame things, it's about how you express things. And this book is an example of that incarnate. It's not just about what happened to him, but how he wanted to present it to the world, what light he wanted it to be seen in, and the censors destroyed all of that. Now that's been restored. And so rather than try to tie this back into my concerns on this channel and my interests, I just want to encourage people to go experience it. Because honestly, I don't think I'm going to be reading a more powerful book than this through the rest of the year. It's that good. And it's also that much more timely now that we have all been witnessing what's been happening with Russia and Ukraine in the last couple of years. So I'm just going to close this video with the last couple of words that Kuznetsov himself uses in the book, the way he himself closes the book. I wish you peace and freedom. With those last two words, by the way, having been deleted by the censors.